Hello, everybody, and welcome today to our webinar on Strengthening the S and ESG, Social Impact Assessment for Major Projects. There are over 1,200 people registered for today's webinar from over 100 different countries, so thank you all for joining us. We are so excited to have you here with us today. Today's webinar is being hosted by the International Association for Impact Assessment, or IAIA, and I am Keisha Blaser. I am facilitating the webinar, but you'll mainly be hearing from our three presenters who you'll meet in just a moment. If at any time during the webinar you hear something that you'd like to share on social media, I encourage you to do so. On the screen, you'll see our Twitter handle there, which is at IAIA Network, as well as a hashtag you can use if you want to share any snippets from the webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to invite you to our website, www.iaia.org, to check out some of the resources we have available for you there. So first, you're going to see some webinars on demand. There are a couple listed there for you from past webinars we've had, including one on human rights and impact assessment, which is in Spanish. And there's a variety of topics, including resettlement, biodiversity, health, and more. So please do check out those, and you can see those past recordings. In addition to webinars, you can see some upcoming events. So in addition to our on-demand webinars, we have some live webinars coming up in February and March on a couple different topics you can register for there. And then in addition to webinars, we also offer online training courses. These courses are ones that we usually have at our in-person conference, and they've been modified to be delivered in an online format. And so right now we have registration open for one course on conflict management in ESIA projects happening in March. So if you'd like information on that course or to register, please check out our website. And then lastly, you can find information on our annual conference, IAIA 24, and this year it's being held in Dublin, Ireland at the end of April. So in addition to the conference and the amazing sessions that you get to hear there, there's also a variety of training courses, including one that's led by the presenters for today's webinar. So if at any point you feel like you'd like to go deeper with some of these concepts, and there's something that really catches your interest, I'd encourage you to go check out information on their training course and see if potentially you could make a trip to Dublin and check it out. Lastly, you'll be able to find information on our professional development program, which is a 12-week asynchronous, so self-paced course on the foundations of impact assessment. And the next round is starting in June, so you can find information on that course, as well as some other downloadable publications like our best practice principles, IA fast tips, and more. So finally, just a couple of pieces of housekeeping. First off, yes, this webinar will be recorded. Since you're registered for the webinar, you are going to get an email within a day or two of the live broadcast with a link to the recording as well as the slides that were used today. And then for questions, at the end of the webinar, we are going to have time for Q&A with the presenters, but you do not have to wait till the end of the webinar to ask your question. So if at any time during the webinar something sparks a question or you're curious about something, feel free to put it into the questions tab, and we'll be monitoring those during the presentation, and then we'll put your questions into the Q&A at the end. And like I mentioned, the slides are available. They will be sent to you in an email following the webinar, but if you'd like to access them now and follow along, you can do so on the Handouts tab on the control panel. So now I'd like to introduce our presenters. First, we have Professor Sarah Bice. Professor Sarah Bice is co-founder and director of the Institute for Infrastructure in Society, or I2S, at the Crawford School of Public Policy, the Australian National University. She is past president of IAIA, and in 2020, she received the IAIA Outstanding Service Award for service to the impact assessment profession. Next, Dr. Ruth O'Connor is an engagement and evaluation specialist at the I2S, where she is working with industry partners to develop indicators for best practice infrastructure engagement. And finally, Dr. Emerson Sanchez is Australian Research Council Research Fellow at the I2S, the Australian National University. Emerson researches environmental discourses, natural resource politics, social movements, and community engagement. So with that, Sarah, over to you.
Keisha, thank you so much, and thank you everyone. We really appreciate your time and your interest in this incredibly important topic. we are very, very glad to be part of IAIA. It's an organization that I've been involved with now for decades, and we're really, really pleased that you're joining us. And we hope that this gives you an opportunity, if you're unfamiliar with IAIA, to start to gain some exposure to the professional development opportunities, the knowledge sharing, and the networks that our association offers. As Keisha said, I'm Professor Sarah Bice. I'd like to say good night, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're joining us from. Today, we are going to delve into the S, the social in ESG, environmental, social, and governance approaches. This is a really large topic and we have a relatively short amount of time. So what we are going to do is move fairly quickly through a structured discussion. But before that, and you may be able to see in the windows behind me, the sun coming up here in beautiful Melbourne, Australia, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I'm broadcasting from, the Wurundjeri and Burrin Warring people of the Kulin Nation here in Narm, a place many of you will know as Melbourne. The traditional custodians of this land have maintained connection to a very unique place for more than 2,000 generations. And I'd like to extend my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to Indigenous and First Nations people, wherever you may be joining us from. Throughout our session today, we want to give you an opportunity to participate and to engage as much as possible. And so we'll have some polls that are available. I'm also going to make quite a lot of use of QR codes, and you'll be able to see those as well when you go into the webinar slides. And so what I would like for you is to make sure that you have access to a variety of resources and opportunities to interact and participate today. So if you've got your mobile phone handy, have it ready because we'll have some QR codes for you throughout the presentation. And that's going to take you to interactive participatory polls like this one, and also to further resources and information for reading. So we really hope that's helpful to you, and please do ask your questions. Thank you to those of you who have sent questions in prior to the webinar. Ruth Emerson and I have been going through those. We've received dozens of questions, and we have tried to incorporate answers to many of those into this main presentation. Keisha mentioned that we are from the Institute for Infrastructure in Society, or I2S, as we're much more easily known. We are the world's leading social science research institute based in the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University, focused on mitigating and hopefully improving social benefits from major infrastructure projects. We look at everything from transport to water to energy to renewables to mining. It's all part and parcel of what we do. And our aims are to inform, improve community engagement around major project delivery, to really help to address the cumulative impacts of major projects. And so looking at the ways in which this big build that's happening around the world is affecting people. We're interested in supporting improved social risk management and social impact assessment. And because we're at the Crawford School of Public Policy, we certainly aim to shape public policy for societal benefit. So as I'm speaking today, you feel free to check out I2S. You can find us at nextgenengagement.org, and we would love for you to get in touch and find out more. The research that I'll be presenting today, so we're going to talk about quite a big topic in terms of ESG, and what I'll be doing is drawing on my own focus in infrastructure, so talking about major infrastructure project delivery and social impact assessment. The research results that I present today have been made possible through the support of our industry partners, who you can see here. And I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank the continued support that they give the Institute to allow us to produce the kinds of insightful social and policy scientific research that we'll present today. Keisha introduced Ruth and Emerson, but I just want to extend my thanks to both of them. They are wonderful colleagues in I2S. Everything that we do is a collaborative group effort, and so all that you see today is the result of the team, and I really appreciate that Ruth and Emerson are joining us early on their Saturday morning. Right. An important question when we do these things is, what's in it for me? Why am I spending my Friday evening or afternoon or Saturday morning online? Because we all spend a lot of time online. What's in it for you today? I'm going to work really hard to ensure that when you leave this webinar, you're going to have an improved understanding of what ESG is and why it matters in the contemporary major project environment. I'm going to introduce an idea, ESG 2.0, and talk about how it's being defined, what's driving it, and how it's being regulated. And then, because I'm a social scientist and I practice SIA, I'm going to focus in on that middle child of ESG, the S, the social, and talk about why and how I think the social really needs greater prioritization and the specific approaches and opportunities that we have available to us to do that. So hopefully when you leave here today, after about 75 minutes, you're going to have a much improved idea of all of those things. Today we're talking about 3 little letters, ESG, and I'm going to attempt to answer 3 very big questions. Those questions are what, why, and how. And for the social scientists in the office, I think you'll feel very much empathic as to that approach because it tends to be what we do. So let's get into the what. When we think about ESG, I think it's helpful when you have a webinar with this many people registered, we're going to have a variety of levels of experience. Some of you may have been working in the ESG space since the early 2000s. Others of you may have just heard this term recently from your boss and you're thinking, gee, I better figure out what that is because it seems important. So let's start with a definition. ESG broadly provides us with a framework for formalizing and legitimating corporate government and multilateral bodies' attention to and prioritization of environmental, social, and governance concerns. And this is compared to, or sometimes in opposition to, a traditional shareholder capitalist concentration on financial matters. So what is ESG? It's really a formal legitimization of organizations prioritizing and bringing to the fore environmental, social, and governance concerns alongside of, or sometimes in preference to, financial concerns. It's a shift in perspective, and it's an incredibly important one, not only for each individual project, but also for our planet. So we've got a poll, and we will put the link to the poll as well in the chat. So if you miss it now, you can certainly head over to the chat and you'll be able to click the link. But one of the things when we talk about really big terms like this, and you're joining us from all over the world, is even when we give a definition, ESG is going to mean different things to different people in different places. And it can really help us to hear back from you in the audience where you are right now in your work with your concentrations and concerns. What does ESG mean to you? So Emerson and Ruth are going to be moderating and monitoring the poll. And if you have some ideas about what ESG means to you, we'd really love to hear it because we know it's more than just these 3 little letters. For me, I would have to say it's something that gives me pause and gives me hope because it means that we are encouraging a formalized focus on these components of projects which go beyond the business case and the cost-benefit analysis. So what is ESG? I've given you a bit of a definition, but importantly, I think it's worthwhile taking a pause to recognize that we are right now in an ESG renaissance. Now, this is a beautiful picture of Florence in Italy where the Renaissance began many centuries ago. It was also the site of an earlier IAIA conference. So for those of you who are new to IAIA, joining up and attending the conferences will get you to some very nice places. Right now, we're experiencing an ESG renaissance. And what do I mean by that, and how can I make that argument? ESG has actually been with us in one form or another since at least the 1950s. So there's this kind of debate at the moment, it's new, or is it? If you look up on the left-hand top left there, you'll see social responsibilities of the businessman. That gives you a sense of when that article was written, and that was Howard Bowen all the way back in 1950. For those of you who've studied corporate social responsibility or work in those roles, Milton Friedman's very famous or infamous 1970 article in the New York Times Magazine, "The social responsibility of business is to increase its profits," or sometimes we say the social responsibility of business is business. You can see that ESG is almost fundamentally opposed to that particular view. In the early 2000s, 2011, Porter and Kramer came out with their framework for creating shared value. And we've also had Archie Campbell back in the late 1990s talking about corporate social responsibility. So I would argue that we've had ESG for quite a long time, and indeed ESG as a term came out in the early 2000s. But what we are seeing now is a bit of a renaissance and a reinvigorated interest in ESG. So for those of you new to it, if you want to go and look at the ways in which ESG has developed, there's an approach which is different to shareholder capitalism, where we're most concerned about the corporate bottom line, and that's stakeholder capitalism. So this is what I would call ESG 1.0, and you can see it coming out of initiatives like in 1998, the establishment of the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative for Sustainability Reporting. In 2000, very famously, the United Nations launched the Millennium Development Goals, now the SDGs, as well as the UN Global Compact. And the UN has very much been at the forefront of this movement as a multilateral agency internationally. 2005, the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. This was one of the first major ESG frameworks we saw emerge. And then you could see ESG start to spread a bit more broadly. Things like in 2006 in the United States, the voluntary establishment of the first B corporations. B corporations are corporations where they have a legal charter to exist for reasons that are not just Milton Friedman's traditional idea of business, but businesses which are social ventures or have environmental concerns at their heart. In 2006, the IFC introduced their environmental and social performance standards, and those have been very influential in how we do social impact assessment, and indeed some leading social impact assessors from IAIA were integral to helping to define those standards back in 2006. So I give you that history there because I think it's really important to recognize that even if ESG is new to you, it's not a new concept, but it's certainly one that we're seeing reinvigorated and coming back to the fore. ESG 2.0 is where we are now, I would argue. And there are three things that have driven this reinvigoration that have really been key drivers. And that's global interconnectedness and contemporary crises. I've only had one coffee today. That's two main things, not three. So global interconnectedness, what have we seen driving ESG 2.0? There has been an acceleration in globalization, particularly in terms of people and finance. We have certainly since the early 2000s, when these original ESG 1.0 frameworks were starting out, there's increase in wider spread internet use. More people have access to the internet and are interconnected. And we've also seen increased migration and global mobility. That has been further sparked and spurred forward by contemporary crises, including the COVID-19 pandemic, which really, I think, starkly reminded us of our global interconnectedness, the climate crisis, which is ongoing and requiring our active response, and a variety now, unfortunately, of geopolitical conflict. So all of these things together are creating an environment in which ESG is experiencing a real renaissance and a reinvigoration. So what does ESG 2.0 look like? What are the key things that are informing this? We're seeing now a number of government-based initiatives emerging, and those may include regulatory requirements. Many of these are spurred by climate action. As an example, just late last year, the Australian government set net zero targets to 2050. And right now, most Australian organizations are expecting that mandatory climate risk disclosures will be the regulation that follows. We've seen in ESG 2.0 during this renaissance an uptick in investor frameworks. The World Bank Environmental and Social Framework, which is available online, that was really pushed forward and initiated in 2016. It was renewed and refreshed in 2018. And then again, last year, the World Bank had a big focus on updating their ESF. The ADB, the Asian Development Bank, with whom many of you may work or have projects, the ADB currently has a draft consultation version of their ESF out for public consultation. So I encourage you to have a look at that, because it's an opportunity now, if this is a space where you're working in and they might be a client or a funder, there is an opportunity right now to inform what their ESF looks like. And we have a variety of transnational standards. So what we're looking at here are things like, late in 2023, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, which came out from the European Commission. So ESG 2.0 really does look like a combination of government-led initiatives, which may or may not include regulation, investor frameworks, particularly from our multilateral development banks, and a variety of transnational standards. Whew, I've been talking for about 15 minutes now, so it's time for a bit of a break here. I just give you a picture of cute dolphins and check in. So some promises that I made to you at the beginning of this webinar were that we were going to achieve a few things together and you'll leave knowing certain things. So hopefully by now, even 14 minutes into what we're doing, what ESG is and why it matters in the contemporary project environment. We've talked a bit about that and how ESG 2.0 is being defined and the key ways it's being regulated or coming into policy. If you're falling asleep, we hope the dolphins wake you up, something different. Let's turn to our second question, this question of why. So why does the S particularly in ESG matter? And what can we do about it? And I can see already there's some comments coming in the poll, and ESG can be so divisive. You know, we hear all the time, oh, it's greenwashing, it's whitewashing, it's pink washing. I've got the pink here just to represent that kind of, you know, pink washing. And it's really a concept that can create a lot of skepticism. Some of us are very, very hopeful, but at the same time we think, oh, you know, does everybody really have the best intentions when it comes to ESG? So let's explore this question of why, and let's hope that many of you on the webinar today are those individuals who can help to make ESG efforts meaningful and genuine. It is absolutely critical to our collective capacity to address climate change. It's critical to social inclusion, and I think it's critical to our sustainable futures. So how can we get beyond this kind of greenwashing, the questions around the limits of ESG? One way that I think that we can do that, and I'm a social scientist, so I'm going to be biased and go for the S. We can focus on the S, and we can do a better job of profiling and prioritizing the social and societal concerns that are affecting individuals, groups, and communities' livelihoods, well-beings, and opportunities for socioeconomic participation across the world. These are absolutely critical issues. They affect human beings on a day-to-day, daily life basis, and they deserve greater attention than what they currently receive. So for me, the S in ESG, it sits in the middle because it is central. And we want to think about how we can really do better to raise the profile of ESG and to make our ESG efforts more meaningful and more genuine. And I do think that there's hope. So this is a hopeful webinar today. For those of you who may be coming at ESG from the environmental or financial or governance side, and many of you will be, it's very helpful to understand, what do these social people mean? Isn't everything society? How do we put boundaries around this? How do we deal with the social? In 2023, the World Bank, led by Louise Cord, who was their then Director of Global Sustainability and Social Inclusion, they put out this book. And fortunately for us, it is open access. And I've given you a QR code here that will take you to that book. Social sustainability in development is incredibly helpful in defining what we mean by the social in ESG and giving you a really simple and understandable framework to think about and hopefully address the S. So a really great resource there and something incredibly current. Another great resource that we do hope that you will use, here at I2S, we've spent 7 years now thinking about how we can better integrate and address the social components of major projects. And last year we produced this report. It's very short. You can read it quickly. It's got lots of graphics. You can reuse it in your own work. Infrastructure for Sustainable Futures. And when we think about the S, we think there are 6 key themes that are emerging globally that most need to be addressed. And this includes Indigenous and First Nations peoples' rights and concerns, socioeconomic inclusion, and that's something a number of the multilateral banks are currently working on, social value. So how can we create more and better social value from these large project investments being made? Right now, we've got trillions and trillions of dollars floating around the world going into major projects. How can communities receive benefit? We're concerned about well-being. We're concerned about resilience. Here in Australia, we are very, very close to many Pacific Island nations, and we can already see the necessity for climate resilience when we look at sea level rise, inundation, and changes to entire nations' populations and living. Resilience is going to be absolutely critical, and how we think about and address that together really matters. And finally, our 6th theme for the S, a fair and just transition. And indeed, in Dublin, when IAIA comes together in April this year, the focus is going to be not just on a fair and just transition, but a fair and just transformation. And so we're really thinking about, how can the social components contribute to the environmental and policy changes, the governance changes that we need to have a sustainable future, hopefully one that our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren can enjoy. It's really helpful when we talk about something as big as the S in ESG to acknowledge that organizations, individuals, and projects are going to approach the S from very different perspectives. And I think that some of the skepticism that creeps into ESG is partly because we have these different perspectives that can support it, and they can often be competing or in tension with one another. And in many instances, even still today, it's the business case perspective that tends to dominate and win out. And that is what leads to these feelings of, and not just feelings, but happenings of greenwashing and less than adequate attention to these issues. So what I want to do is I want to look at, why is the S important? And we're going to take it from these 3 perspectives: business case, the policy case, or the governance and regulation side, and the communities case, that real S, the social side where individual human beings are being affected. So for the business case, social risk management is key. We run year on year an annual survey of infrastructure sector professionals, the state of infrastructure and engagement. And all of this work is available online. And this year we're taking the survey internationally. We hope many of you might be our respondents. When we ask infrastructure sector professionals in Australia last year, how does your project or organization think about ESG? Their number one way of thinking about it, so just over a quarter of organizations here in Australia, they're focusing on this as business and reputational risk. So this is very much an ESG 1.0 approach, something that looks at how dealing with externalities to the business can then influence the business reputation. When we think about the business case perspective and we think about the S, where do the concerns come from? In the business case, organizations are concerned about the costs. So what are they going to have to pay if they get the social component wrong? They're often focused on acceptance. So how do we get people to just accept the projects that we're wanting to give to them? And that is a social license to operate in various forms, the level of acceptance of a policy or a project within a defined community. And from a business case perspective, the S is also about future business. So how can we become a supplier or a developer of choice? How do we build up our reputation? And it's this particular component of a business case focused approach to ESG that often leads to greenwashing or whitewashing or pinkwashing. Here on the screen, the QR code is going to take you to a landmark report. Now, this goes all the way back now almost 10 years to 2014. In fact, it is 10 years. How did that happen? Rachel Davis and Daniel Franks, working with Harvard professor, the late John Ruggie, produced the costs of company community conflict focused in the extractive sector. And they came up with a figure that where we see community conflict pausing mining and extractives projects, companies bear on average a cost of US $20 million per week. So there is a very strong business case for getting the social piece right. The business case is incredibly important, but also we do not want to limit ourselves to the business case because it can lead to this greenwashing that we all wish were not happening. What else tells us about the business case? Year on year in the State of Infrastructure and Engagement Survey, we ask infrastructure sector professionals during the past year on all the projects on which you were working, what were the major influences of project delays or cancellations? And year on year since 2018, the top three elements are stakeholder and community pressure, regulatory and planning issues, and project funding. So of those top three major influential factors year on year, 2 out of 3 are social. 2 out of 3 ain't bad in telling us that the social really matters. We also ask our industry experts year on year where you experience project delays or cancellations. To what extent did adverse stakeholder pressure, that social pressure, play a role? And in 2022, on all the projects on which they were working, our experts said, and this is almost 40%, so 38% reported a good to a great deal of adverse stakeholder pressure that was playing a role in delays or cancellations. So even from a business case perspective, we know that the S in ESG matters. There's also a policy case to be made. And so this is really connecting the S and the G in ESG, the social and the governance. We also ran a very large study, Australian Perspectives on Infrastructure. We surveyed over 5,000 members of the Australian public. And here you can see the national trust model that was built with social research firm Vaconic. In our national trust model, the number one driver of public trust in major project delivery is their confidence in government regulation to appropriately guide the projects and protect public interest. So regulation becomes incredibly important to the social piece because that governance informs trust and it informs acceptance. So there is a very, very strong policy case to be made for paying more attention to the S in ESG. What we see here as well is the role in that interconnection between the S and the G. If you look across this top line, the top driver, if we look across East Coast states in Australia, and these are some of our major states, the top driver of public trust in infrastructure is trust in government. So we really, really need to think about those government relationships and how regulation and policy can assist us to have trust in government. So what do we think about as well? What does the S in ESG matter? Why does it matter for policy? It matters because we want to see trust, credibility, and legitimacy come to the fore. And that's a really, really important way for governments to think about how can they best support the work that they're doing and really raise the profile of the S. So these are the things to focus on: trust, credibility, and legitimacy. We know this is incredibly important for government. Finally, and this is presented third, but I think it is the most important component of a perspective on the S, and the community's perspective is a perspective that we'd really like to see raised up even more. The community's perspective tells us that paying attention to the S in ESG is critical to supporting community resilience. So this is a very, very dense graphic here, and I show this to you not because I expect that you're going to understand and interpret it in a very short showing, but more to give you confidence that there is very robust research which sits behind my assertion that the community's case is really worthwhile engaging. This data comes from our survey of over 5,000 members of the Australian public, and we focus in on those individuals in communities who are experiencing the greatest number of projects at any one time. And we wanted to look at how S factors, social factors, influence particular qualities of communities. And so here we've modeled how social factors in major projects influence community resilience. And let me focus in on a part of this diagram because I think it'll make it very clear. What we see for communities and why the S is so important: the relationship quality that communities have with governments and project developers delivering. There we go, we got the slides back now. The way that we think about project developers delivering projects is looking at community engagement and consultation, and the way in which that community engagement and consultation drives community resilience. So for those of you who are working in community engagement or related forms of social impact assessment, that time that you take to build relationships with communities, the way that you focus on delivering high quality engagement, that is incredibly important. And indeed, our models show it is a statistically significant driver of levels of resilience in communities. Now, we can say this at least for projects in Australia, but I wouldn't be surprised if this relationship bears out in projects globally. So a focus on the social is incredibly important, if for no other reason that by getting the social piece right, by doing good consultation and engagement, including through a variety of types of impact assessment, we can really drive community resilience. We also know that there is a huge opportunity for the financial investments being made today in major infrastructure to contribute to key aspects of social improvement, and that includes social inclusion. So the opportunity for all members of a society, or a community to participate equally in socioeconomic opportunities. When we asked infrastructure sector professionals from across Australia, to what extent do you agree or disagree infrastructure development should contribute to social inclusion? We saw not only that 52% of professionals agreed, but that 24% strongly agreed. So more than 3/4 of infrastructure sector experts are saying the work that we do in investing and delivering major projects, that work should contribute to social inclusion. So the S has a key piece to play here. We're seeing an increased acceptance that projects should do more than simply deliver physical amenity or financial benefit. And I think that's really critical. When we think about the community's perspective for the S in ESG, we also ask sector professionals, what can projects really do? What can they deliver? What can their role be? And these are the top 5 most important types of social value that can be created from investment in major infrastructure projects, according to our experts. Now, obviously, number 1, access to infrastructure and services, just getting people the basics that they need. But where urban planning is done well and infrastructure is designed in a way that thinks about livability and well-being factors, major infrastructure can also advance housing affordability and choice. It can support well-being, safety, and resilience. And there's an entire literature of research on gendered infrastructure and the ways in which good infrastructure design can improve women's participation in societies. So these things are really critical. And from a community's perspective, when we think about what does the S mean and what can it deliver, it can give us a lot of things, and it is well worth the focus. So let's sum up then. I told you that I was going to talk to you about the why in the S. So why does the S matter? If we look at these 3 major perspectives, the business case, the policy case, which connects really nicely to that G of governance, and the community's case, that core S, these are the reasons from each perspective as to why the S matters. So for business, to recap, it's all about cost and reducing the costs of delays or project cancellations. It's about acceptance, which can help to smooth project delivery and smooth out community protest. And it's about future business and reputation. From the policy perspective, we're really focused on what governance need most in order to operate and run effectively as public institutions: trust, legitimacy, and credibility. And from a community's perspective, it's all about the good stuff: resilience, socioeconomic inclusion, and creating social value from the major investments that are being made. All right, this is where we wake you up because I've been talking a lot. Checking in. So now we have done tick number 2 of our 3 aims for today, talking about why the S in ESG is critical to our sustainable futures. For those of you who have some ideas and other ideas about why the S is important, we certainly invite you to share those with us, and you can share those in the chat and you can share those in the Q&A. There's one final big question that I'm going to aim to answer for you today, and then we're going to open up to a variety of questions and a facilitated panel discussion. So the question then becomes, how? Well, that's great, Sarah. You've introduced us to ESG 2.0. You've given us the key drivers and talked about what that looks like. You've made some evidence-based arguments as to why the S in ESG is really important from 3 really critical perspectives: business, policy, and community. But how are we actually going to do something about this? And in my time with IAIA, we were regularly focused on the how, that really getting down into communities, getting down into projects, and doing the work. So let's think about how can we do the work of the S in ESG. While we're doing that, if you want to give us some ideas about how we can do the work, our second poll today is focused on what one action could help raise the S in ESG. So feel free to answer that. It may go by a little bit quickly, but you're also welcome to put answers to that in the Q&A or in the chat. Whew. There's a lot of challenges to getting the S piece right and to integrating the S truly into ESG so that we get into a genuine engagement. Some of the key challenges include that the S is really blurry. We're talking about social and societal issues. It is incredibly difficult when you have project, resource, budget, and capacity requirements that need to be met to then say, right, we're going to deal with these social issues, which may or may not be directly attributable to our particular project. So causality, you know, our project causes X, Y, and Z in society. Those blurry boundaries can make it really difficult to integrate the S, and it's often the reason that organizations or projects avoid the S. And what I would say is it is no longer possible for us to put the social in the too hard basket. We need better ways and better approaches. We need to figure out how to do this because it is critical. Right now, communities around the world are experiencing infrastructure intensive environments and climate changes which are unprecedented. The cumulative effects of this are leading to social and societal changes, to geopolitical conflict, and it must be addressed. So this is really, really critical. These are huge challenges, but they're also challenges that we must face, and we must face them together. So how can we do this, particularly when the third challenge that I would point out for the S in ESG is that the S is often a very under-resourced area. And within organizations, those individuals working on community engagement, stakeholder engagement, social impact assessment, for those of you in the audience today, we see you, we hear you, we feel you, we know that you are often the most under-resourced teams compared to your environmental, governance, and financial counterparts. So hang in there. The work you do is incredibly important, and we know that you need more resources and support. And when we talk about the how of the S in ESG, there are some ways to really boost the legitimacy and the profile of what you do, and I'm going to talk through those now. So how can this S be better integrated? How can you gain more traction if you are a social practitioner? There are three key principles we need to focus on. The approach to the social needs to be systematic. So we can't be doing this in a piecemeal kind of way, particularly because of those blurry boundaries I mentioned before. We need systematic approaches. We need approaches that are accessible, because many times you are going to be making the argument for the social piece to engineers, to risk managers, to finance managers, to project managers, individuals who are most comfortable, for better or for worse, in a quantitative space. So we really need the S to be systematic and accessible. And when it is, it can also become comparable. So we want to empower you with tools and frameworks in the work of the S that will allow you to really demonstrate changes over time, to compare impact performance between projects, and to be genuinely, robustly accessible. So how can we do this? It's a big, big challenge, and it's one that we've been looking at for literally decades. Well, it's good to know that impact assessment is a really good start. So for those of you new to IAIA, I really encourage you, get involved in this global network of professional practice and expertise, because impact assessment provides one of the most immediate and advanced ways of having systematic, accessible, and comparable approaches to the social data in ESG. Social impact assessment SIA, as it's better known, we have some really, really big expectations for what it can do. And ideally, what SIA should do for you in this realm of the social is to provide evidence-informed guidance, which incorporates community perspectives, and that will allow you to mitigate or prevent negative social impacts. And at the same time, we hope it will also allow you to leverage social benefit and contribute to sustainability. SIA is one of the key hows of ESG. For those of you who might be new to SIA, IAIA in 2015 put out the first global guidelines for social impact assessment, and this QR code will take you there. We also see a growth in environmental and social frameworks, or ESF. And so for those of you working in the multilateral development community or working on projects funded by MDBs, the World Bank, the ADB, and the EBRD are all leaders in this space producing advice. We see too a growth and an availability when we talk about systematic, accessible, and comparable. You can also turn to a variety of readily available principles and performance standards. These include the Quality Infrastructure Investment Standards, which have been created by the World Bank in partnership with JICA, the IFC, which I mentioned before, the Environmental and Social Performance Standards. For those of you working in a corporate social responsibility or creating shared value space, ISO 26000 can be incredibly helpful as the first global standard for CSR. And right now as well, from the OECD, we see emerging the Blue Dot Initiative, which is a world-first certification program for sustainable infrastructure. So all of these can be worthwhile checking out. If you're working on major projects, and that could be road, rail, water, renewable energy, mining, extractives, here at I2S, we have produced the world-first standard for quality assurance of community engagement for major projects. And the IEE standards are publicly available for use, designed by industry, validated by community members. If this is something that you could use in your work, attempting to engage with communities in best practice in a high quality way, please do get in touch, because we're consistently and regularly helping organizations across the world to improve their community engagement quality. We also have social risk management frameworks available. So when we talk about systematic, accessible, and comparable, social risk management is absolutely a critical part of this. It integrates really well with social impact assessment and can be an ongoing means of risk identification, assessment, and management. We've developed a social risk maturity model, which gives us a framework for social risk management. And we also have our I2S 3Ps framework, Place, Proponent, Project, which provides you with a risk management framework of the most common social risks facing major projects and indicators for beginning to assess those, advice on how to respond. So plenty of tools and frameworks available to support the how. If you're really interested in social risk management, if what we've talked about so far today, and in a moment I'll go over to our panelists so that you can hear from people other than myself. I've been talking for some time. At IAIA this year, Ruth Emerson and I are very, very privileged to be training in social risk management for major projects, tools and frameworks to support just transformations. And if you'd like to join us, the course and registration details are available in the QR code. This is my favorite Australian bird. It got voted Best Australian Bird of the Year last year. It's a tawny frogmouth. I figure it's a good photo to end on. He looks pretty wise. I hope that you're feeling a bit wiser after this long discussion. In this final check-in, the things that we have just covered are the ways in which the S in ESG is commonly assessed and the things that are going to be most helpful to you. And that includes social impact assessment, ideally using the IAIA guidance for best practice SIA, multilateral development bank ESF frameworks, and a variety of principles, frameworks, and toolkits that are available from leading organizations throughout the world, including our very own I2S. So I really hope that this has been a meaningful and helpful presentation for you today. We would love to have your questions and feedback, and I sincerely thank you for your time and attention. Keisha, over to you to moderate some questions.
Awesome. Hello. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. We've had a few coming in here. So Ruth and Emerson, if you'd like to come on and answer some of these questions, that would be great. Perfect. Hello. Thank you both for joining. Okay, the first question I have is for Ruth. What needs to change to get better integration of social considerations in investment?
Thanks for that, Keisha, and hi to everyone today. Sorry if I'm a bit slow off the mark. It's fairly early here in Australia. But I guess, you know, reflecting back on some of the things that Sarah's just been discussing, and from our work that we've done, particularly in relation to major infrastructure in Australia, one of the things that we're finding is that people in the poll were talking a lot about in order for us to have a bigger profile and more sort of influence in this space, you know, we need good data and we need to involve communities. And what we're finding in Australia at the moment is that the sort of expertise that is being drawn upon in some of those really early stages of projects, so when we're talking about the business case and those sort of early stages of projects, is the types of expertise that they're drawing upon is actually quite narrow, and it reflects the sort of history of the sector. It tends to be more engineers or people with a financial or legal background, and people with social backgrounds just don't get much input, which has really fundamental implications for how issues are even framed, never mind actual accurate consideration of social risks or social values. So I think one of the key things that needs to happen in order for this to shift is that we need consideration of the social benefits and social risks and how we involve communities in articulating those to be much more embedded in projects from the beginning. So I think that's a key thing, and the implications of that is, you know, so in a sense more like health and safety, for example. And so our current guidelines for how to deliver these sort of projects, our quality assurance frameworks, Jefferson's done some work on in Australia, all those sort of things need to shift to reflect that consideration and prioritise it.
Great, thank you, Ruth. Emerson, this next question is for you. How do we address sustainable finance for the global South developing countries?
Yeah, thanks so much, Keisha, and also thanks, Sarah, for that wonderful presentation. Yeah, I think if our attendees have heard already, I think a preview of the answer to this question posed by one of our participants. Yeah, so I think one of the pathways that we have now. So Sarah was talking about the policy framework developed by multilateral development banks like World Bank and ADB on environmental and social sustainability framework. So we have those, and well, what we see here is a pathway that exists for ESG requirements by these multilateral development banks for borrowing governments in the global South for their development projects. And this is already, I think, a good step, but I think what we want to see, and the intention for ESG anyway, is that that there's this pathway of strengthening ESG practices also from the private sector, so that there's more, I guess, a broader practice of ESG when implementing major projects. Well, not just in the global south, but I guess, we want to see this practice everywhere. Yeah, so I think those are two pathways that one is already existing, and then another one that that we're hoping that could be widely practiced in different parts of the world, also from the private sector. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, Ruth, back to you. Next question is engaging earlier the key to achieving social value in investment?
Glad you asked me that, Keisha. Yeah, it's something that being an engagement professional, I'm not sure about other people tuned into the webinar. I get a slight bugbear about it because it seemed like, oh, if only we did it early, everything would have been okay. And I think there is obviously a degree of truth to that. So I think that's a yes and no answer. And I think one of the things is engaging with who. And so what we found in our work is that early engagement is starting to happen in Australia. And where it's happening is between the proponents of major projects and the consultants that they want to share their risk with. And because we have a lot of major infrastructure projects happening in Australia at the moment, it's a consultants market. And so they can be choosier about which projects they want to take on. And so some early engagement is happening. Unfortunately, those conversations don't appear to have much of a focus on the social aspects of the project. So I think early engagement's not a simple fix. I think we absolutely need to do it to actually discover what communities need and value, and to sort of set the value proposition from the beginning. But likewise, some other work that Sarah and Emerson have been involved with the Institute say, well, there's also talk about community burnout, where we've got all these projects. God, we can't be engaging them too much because there's too much engagement and everyone's just burnt out and don't want to know about it. But what we're finding is it's not actually that there's too much, it's what is the nature of that engagement? What is the quality of it? Is it at a tokenistic, let's tick a box that, yeah, we talked to the community, but we didn't really listen to them. So the key is, if you're going to do it well.
Absolutely, thank you. All right, Emerson, back to you. Next question. What are the most recent measures, standards, and guidelines for the social and sustainability aspects of major projects?
Thanks a lot, Keisha. And also, I'm not sure if the one who asked that is in the audience now. That's also, I think, yeah, that's the big question. It's, I think, having guidelines and being able to implement those is really the most important thing for ESG. In terms of policy framework, so because we're with the Crawford School of Public Policy, so part of our research is looking at is doing policy analysis on looking at social considerations in different policies. So what we found out is there's a high level of robustness in terms of social considerations in both international and national policies in Australia. And as I mentioned a while ago, multilateral development banks have been quite active on this front. And Sarah also mentioned this in her presentation. And I would say just a little bit of background, and I think some of our audience members would know this, that this is mostly a response to a history of well-publicized opposition to their development projects. I don't know how far back, but just with my own research, I think this goes as far back as the 70s at least. So we see a significant development on policy frameworks. But then if we look at, to answer the question, if we look at the presence of specific guidelines, there's a bit of an evenness about this in terms of policy. So in Australia, for example, what we saw in our work is guidelines on social considerations are clearer when there are social impact assessment guideline documents. However, what we found is looking at different states in Australia, these documents are not found in all the states, unfortunately. So because of that, the practice also gets a bit uneven because yeah, people just don't have this a guideline document to make things standard. Yeah, so there's a lot of work I think that needs to be done, not just in Australia, but I think across the world in having some standardization of these ESG practices. It's not that it's not there, but I think some standardization can be quite helpful. And then, as Sarah also mentioned, another area where social considerations could take root is in risk management of major projects. So at the moment, our own research is still in the early stages. We see that risk management has a stronger focus on technical aspects of a project, but there are also existing spaces for social aspects. So there's that opportunity for development in this area in terms of establishing social risk management frameworks and tools, which our institute is currently doing, but we're still in the early stages. Yeah, so I hope that's helpful. Thanks, Keisha.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, now either of you are welcome to take these questions. The first one, and Ruth, you did kind of touch on the community involvement piece in your last answer there too. But this question asks, how do we pull out the core values from the community to make sure that the developers are adding to the community-driven outcomes? So for example, if the community wants improvement in social services and the company donates an expensive helicopter, how do we pull out the core values of a community?
Hey Ruth, can I come in on this one?
Please
Keisha,
do.
this is such a good question. So years ago, it's a long time now, when I wrote my PhD, this was one of the central issues that I was looking at. So how do these big organizations who are going into communities and having major environmental and social impacts, how are they deciding, what communities need? And the answer was, and unfortunately in many cases still is, they don't usually take the time to figure out what communities need before they just give them stuff. So I have an article, it's available, it's called "No More Sunshades, Please." And that was a quote from a local school principal in a mining town in remote northwestern Australia, who there were a lot of mining companies around his elementary school. And those mining companies didn't really take the time to understand what local communities wanted or needed, what they valued, what they saw as the future vision for themselves. They simply made an assumption that, well, you're running a primary school and it's northwestern Australia where we've got a really big skin cancer problem and lots of hot sun, so you must need a sunshade. And so these mining company professionals would rock up with their pickup truck and a big sunshade in the back, and they were really excited. And the principal would go, "Mate, no more sunshades, please. I got 5. So what we need to do is think about how do we integrate a process of community consultation, meaningful community consultation, very, very early in a project, or more ideally, done through government processes where communities are able to come together to articulate their values and their vision for who they are and what they hope to be. And Ruth mentioned consultation fatigue before. We see this in a variety of communities all over the world right now because they've got lots of projects happening next to one another. And in many instances, because of the regulatory environment, each individual project will have individual consultation requirements, and they're done in a siloed way, and community members are approached on a project by project basis, not from their perspective of a person living in the community. So another thing that we really need to do, and I talked a lot today about processes and policies and regulation, and I saw in one of the questions in the chat, someone saying, look, we got to get the regulatory piece right if we're going to get the social piece right. And I agree. So we really do as well need to think about how can we shift the perspective to be one that is place-based, that is community-centric. And from there, I think you will see a better understanding of communities' desires, but also a better capacity to respond to it meaningfully. So that's a great question.
Great. Emerson, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think Sarah was, in a way, was touching a little bit on the, I guess, an improvement in practice of community engagement. But our annual survey in the Institute of I2S, we had 6 years already, consistently, although this is a self-assessment, this is self-reporting, they have a high assessment of their own practices. But I think what we're seeing as another issue is resourcing, that just in terms of budget, community engagement always has, like less than 1% of the total project budget. So I think just based on their self-assessment, our interpretation is that the quality, they know what is good quality engagement and they can do it. It's just that I think there's just not, the money is not there all the time. So I think resourcing is another issue that needs to be addressed. People see community engagement as important. I think they know how to do it well, but sometimes if you don't have the resources, then our community engagement departments for major projects, would have obvious constraints without those important resources for people and for money. Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, we've gotten a couple questions that are kind of on this idea of, how to get people to buy in if they don't think it's maybe their responsibility or if it's their role. So specifically, this person asked, how do we make the case when working with government clients for strengthening their social risk management systems, especially because many social issues like labor and ethnic or minority or indigenous rights can get political and sensitive quickly. So how can we get those government clients on board to strengthen their social risk management systems?
Okay, so this is where we have to, as social practitioners, be incredibly strategic. And we know that what will get the attention of most governments around the world is going straight to the budget. So they're concerned about finances and expenditure. Historically, in the social space, we have lacked data, or at least data of the type that is comparable to or similar to that of our finance experts and engineers. What we're doing at I2S is we are producing the social data that social practitioners need to go into the room to make exactly these arguments. Why should governments and funders pay attention to the social components? Why should social practitioners, including social impact assessors, be at the decision-making table? And why should social components of projects be prioritized? So our argument is you need the data, you need the evidence, because that is what your governments are going to listen to, particularly if that evidence and data can demonstrate that getting the social piece wrong, failing to invest in appropriate social impact assessment, community engagement, and ongoing community monitoring and evaluation processes is going to cost them money. Here in Australia, we have an estimated figure of $30 billion of losses over a decade in major projects contributed to by stakeholder and community pressure. Year on year in our State of Infrastructure and Engagement Survey, we see that the top 3 most influential factors on project delays and cancellations, which cost money, the top 3 most influential factors are stakeholder and community pressure, regulatory and policy issues, and that includes that political component that our colleague mentioned in the question, policy backflipping, changes in political support for a particular project that's been promised, often as an election campaign promise, and project funding. So what we are doing at I2S is we're working very hard every day with our government and industry partners to build up a social scientific evidence base which will allow you to make these arguments to governments and to funders to demonstrate that if we get the social piece wrong, there is a material and real financial cost. Now, Emerson, Ruth, and I think I can speak on behalf of all of us, we really care not so much about the costs, but about the well-being and sustainability of our communities. But what we see strategically is that if we want good social practitioners in empowered positions where you can influence and prioritize community well-being, resilience, and livelihoods, you've got to gain a seat at the table. And so using evidence in this way to demonstrate that the work that you do is of value from the perspective of the decision makers, and usually that's financial, then you can start to affect change. And we can see as well, I talked today about the communities piece, the work that you then do has a genuine and direct influence on things like community resilience. But you've got to get the seat at the table first, and we think this data and evidence is the way to do that.
Great, thank you. Okay, this is kind of going back a little bit, but this person just asked, every one of you has mentioned quality engagement. What does that look like? What is quality engagement?
I bet Ruth has an answer on this one. What do you reckon?
It's a good question, and I'll give an answer that's sort of very influenced by who I'm working for, and Sarah presented in her slides some work that we've been doing. So you've obviously got international frameworks like IAIA and things like that set a certain standard for engagement. But we've developed also specifically for the infrastructure sector the standards, that round pie chart that Sarah showed in one of her slides, and that's been developed with our industry partners and validated through some of the survey work that Sarah also talked about. And so there are some principles that are available that can guide you in doing what we call sort of quality engagement. I mean, I think the thing about any of those things is, as social scientists, we're very aware that, you need to contextualize, all the work that you do and be very aware of the social situation that you're applying those in, and, all the nature of the project, the people, place and purpose and project type of stuff that, Emerson's talking about. So there are guidelines out there for how to do good quality engagement. But I think, placing the community's needs and being aware of that context is really, at the heart of it.
Great, thank you. Another question here is asking, and again, Ruth, this might be more for you because you just mentioned it, but really for any of you, more of a practical question, how do you overcome consultation fatigue? And is it appropriate for a practitioner to fund local representatives to canvass for issues, needs, or concerns?
I can have a beginning crack, but Sarah might also want to speak to that because she's more familiar with some of the data that we've collected on that. I know from personal experience, and Sarah just mentioned about the situation where each particular project has a certain box they have to tick about, well, yes, we've consulted the community and things like that. But I can say that I don't know if it's going to fit within those guidelines, but something that can help with those sort of things is that you work with existing organisations or entities that represent communities. Now, of course, you have to be careful that that is a representative group, but in terms of having some consistent point of contact that is aware of all the things like, oh yes, we've had over the last 5 years, we've had 3 or 4 other people coming through, that you've got that point of reference that cuts across the different projects that are going on, and also has that established legitimacy and credibility with the community. So that's certainly one thing that I've found as a researcher who does very short-term work. You're very conscious that you're in for 2 or 3 years and then you're out. To try and build a relationship in that time is extremely difficult. So working with people that have established relationships and can broker those sort of things for you can be helpful. But I might pass over to Sarah because I'm sure she's got some other perspectives on that type of approach. Sarah?
Thanks, Ruth. I completely agree with your comments and perspectives. This year in the 6th annual State of Infrastructure and Engagement Survey, each year we have a battery of questions that we ask about how major projects are going and being delivered relative to community concerns. And we also explore every year a selected deep dive topic. And one of our deep dives this year was consultation fatigue. So we've got data on this, and that information will be publicly available soon. So please do check out the nextgenengagement.org website for all of our reports. You can access those, and we hope that you can use them to support your work. The advice that we have on consultation fatigue, it's a terrific question. 85% of our experts surveyed believe strongly that poor engagement increases levels of fatigue in communities. So we've got a really nice intersection here between two questions from the audience. How do you have quality engagement? What does that look like? We've got some advice and principles around best practice, high quality engagement. And if you institute those and you really work towards those, you can start to be more assured that you are producing and providing communities with best quality engagement. That's combined with these findings around consultation fatigue. And the key takeaway for me, and that we have a variety of findings in that data, the key takeaway for me is that many communities around the world don't have consultation fatigue per se. In fact, when we survey communities, including the most impacted communities, about whether or not they would prefer more information about what's happening in their communities, the majority of those say, yes, we want the information. And indeed, 20% of those most impacted communities say that they would like even more consultation and information than they're receiving. So what we think is happening is not consultation fatigue. It's not that people don't want to be consulted. They have poor consultation fatigue. They don't want bad engagement, meaningless engagement, tick a box engagement. So the question as well about, is it worthwhile if a government or a central organization can collect data and information about a community that can then be used across projects? I would say absolutely. Any form of community-centered engagement approach that can be used, where information can be collected about people from their positions as individuals in the community and from the perspective of their daily lives, and then shared across projects, that's really, really going to help consultation fatigue, and it's also going to help improve the quality of engagement. So I think it's a great idea. If you can make it happen, make it happen. But our key message, and this is based in the evidence, is it's not consultation fatigue, it's bad consultation fatigue. Thanks, Keisha.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And unfortunately, we did not get to everybody's questions. There's plenty that came in, but it is time for us to wrap up here. So thank you to Sarah, Ruth, and Emerson. You guys, it was a great presentation and discussion. Again, we had plenty of questions coming in, so I'm sorry if we didn't get a chance to get to yours. But let's keep this conversation going. So I am going to share here again, our handle for our socials, as well as hashtags you can use. So if you are an IAIA member and you are in the hub, please feel free to post something about the webinar in the hub. It would be great to hear, the takeaways that you had from the webinar. Any of the, maybe post the question. If your question did get answered, you could put it in the hub and see what other members have to say. And as you leave here today, you're going to be prompted to fill out a survey, and we'd love to get your feedback. There's one question about future topics you'd like to hear discussed in a webinar, so please share any suggestions, and we'll work on finding the experts to get those topics covered for you. So a final thanks to all of you who joined us, and a special thanks to our presenters and panelists. It was so great to have you here with us today or tonight, wherever you're joining us from. And we know your time is valuable, so with that, we hope you found this use of your time valuable as well. So have a great day, and we will see you next time. Thank you.